Hello and welcome to The Voluntarist, your friendly neighborhood guide through the marketplace of ideas. But what exactly is a voluntarist? What is voluntarism? Voluntarism, sometimes called voluntarism, is a philosophy which holds that all forms of human association should be voluntary, according to the Wikipedia page anyways. Nonetheless, at the core of voluntarism is a fierce defense of voluntary action, so a true definition of voluntarism must address why voluntary action is paramount. This explanation begins with the observation that each person has a de facto ownership over their own body, meaning simply that everyone has a real, effective control over the actions of their own body, barring various mental illnesses. It's important to distinguish between legal ownership and real ownership, so I'll borrow a point that I made in a previous video. If you own a car on paper, which is to say you legally own the car, but a friend borrows your car one day, while your friend has their hands on the steering wheel and their foot on the gas pedal, they are the de facto owner of the car. If they turn the steering wheel, the car will turn. If they apply pressure to the gas pedal, the car will accelerate. They are in control of your car, not you, no matter what some piece of paper might have to say about it. The difference between your friend controlling your car and you controlling your body is that anyone can drive the car. It has no consciousness, it's got no awareness, it's got no moral agency. It's just a machine. You, on the other hand, are a living being capable of autonomous action and thought. In a sense, you are both the driver and the car simultaneously, separable only by death or severe mental illness, again. For this reason, it can be said that you, by virtue of being alive, are in de facto ownership of yourself. After observing the axiom of self-ownership, it can also be said that losing ownership over yourself would mean either death or being reduced to a subhuman state, which I've described before as being a living object. That doesn't sound very fun now, does it? I make this point to emphasize the importance of self-ownership to voluntarism. If a person merely exists, having been stripped of the capacity to exercise their own free will regarding how they use their body to interact with the world around them, there is precious little difference between said person and a rock. Whoever has removed their capacity to exercise free will can manipulate them just as easily as picking up a stone. This is, by definition, inhumane. Now, with that all being established, it can be said that every degradation of a person's self-ownership is a diminution of their humanity, their personhood. As such, the defense of every personal liberty which extends from self-ownership without violating similar liberties in others ought to be defended as we value our humanity. There are several of these liberties which include freedom of speech, freedom of religion, private property, freedom of association, and so on. This brings us back to the original definition of voluntarist philosophy. We can now see that freedom of association is an individual liberty derived directly from the axiom of self-ownership. With this insight, it can be said that all forms of human association should be voluntary, because involuntary association would be the violation of self-ownership. So why, then, does the definition given on the Wikipedia page only discuss freedom of association as the primary platform of voluntarist philosophy? This is because as long as all human association is voluntary, every other personal freedom is also protected. For example, if I want to speak, I am free to do so as long as nobody threatens me with violence in order to force me to stop. If I want to gather sticks from an unclaimed plot of land, I am free to do so unless someone threatens me with violence. In both of these examples, my association with these people, forcing me to stop whatever peaceful activity I was attempting to do, is involuntary because they are imposing their will on me without my consent. You may think that this all sounds very utopian. Voluntary interactions are something to strive for, but we'll never get to the point where all human associations are voluntary. You're completely correct, but this doesn't mean the voluntarist philosophy is false or incorrect. Consider that rape is wrong. It's nearly universally agreed rape is wrong. Just because we can never completely prevent rape from happening, this doesn't mean we should just accept that rape happens and turn a blind eye to victims. The same goes for murder, theft, assault, and fraud. We condemn these things as wrong, regardless of how often they occur, and seek to punish those who commit these offenses. Furthermore, each of these offenses listed above is a violation of self-ownership because each offense involves a non-consensual, involuntary association between a victim and an attacker. So far, I hope I've demonstrated that there's nothing really all that controversial about voluntarist philosophy. Murder, theft, rape, assault, and fraud are all wrong because they violate the victim's self-ownership, thereby attacking their humanity. This is a generally agreeable sentiment. However, voluntarism is a philosophy which implies a code of ethics based on negative rights, as I just more or less enumerated. The reason voluntarism is so powerful as an ideology is because, as it implies a code of ethics, it must be universally applied, which means any and all violations of individual liberties must be denounced as morally wrong on the grounds that there must be necessarily present in any such violation the violation of a victim's self-ownership. It is from this universal application of the idea that self-ownership must be respected at all times that voluntarism makes its claim to fame by pointing out that coercive institutions, including nation-states, are morally wrong. Yes, that's correct. Voluntarism dares to apply a code of ethics to government. Let me show you a few examples of what happens when we do this. If it's wrong for me to steal, it must also be wrong for the government to steal. If it's wrong for me to commit fraud, it must also be wrong for the government to commit fraud. If it's wrong for me to murder, it must also be wrong for the government to murder. Furthermore, I'll go so far as to say that these statements are 100% true and correct, unless, of course, someone out there is willing to make the argument that a majority vote can make anything the government decides to do morally right. If there are 3 people on a boat in the middle of the Atlantic and 2 of them vote to throw the third overboard, are you willing to say they did nothing wrong because they had a majority vote? Careful with your response. You wouldn't want to say anything bad about democracy. In any case, theft is wrong for anyone to commit at all times, even government officials with a lot of votes. So if a person does not want to fund a certain government program, such as abortion subsidies or a particular war they may disagree with, they ought to have the right to withhold tax money from those programs. They worked for that money using their bodies, engaging in mutually beneficial voluntary exchanges, and as such have a rightful ownership over that money they've earned as an extension of their own self-ownership. But what happens if someone withholds taxes from an institution like the IRS? At first, they may get a phone call or a letter, then a subpoena to appear in court. Then, if they continue not to pay, armed men with guns will come to their home or place of work to forcibly detain them, abduct them in the back of a car, and force them into a cage. So I ask you this: who really has de facto ownership over what you think of as your money? Now, when you consider that every nation-state in the world is funded via compulsory taxation, which allows the world's governments to legally rob their citizens who have no choice in the matter but to pay up or else, we can easily show that governments are the largest violators of self-ownership and assailants of personhood throughout all of human history. And if that isn't enough to convince you, consider that in the 20th century alone, nation-states murdered roughly 250 million of their own citizens, a statistic which does not include war. Simply Google democide to learn more. Remember, if it's wrong for you to murder someone, it's also wrong for a government to murder someone. This is the power of voluntarism and its consequential code of ethics. It allows us to hold each and every person, regardless of status, power, or influence, to the same moral standards, that each person must respect the self-ownership of each other person. Most people will agree that voluntary interaction and mutual consent are good and should be respected at all times, but for some reason, many people are unwilling to apply this same reasoning to the power of the state. If you are one of those people, I will invite you to tell me how your ideology can be internally consistent while still allowing for theft and murder on the part of bureaucrats and elected officials. I took that challenge, and my attempt to answer led me to where I am today. If you enjoyed this video or thought it was interesting, be sure to check out the rest of my channel. Thank you for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one.